In the bitter winds sweeping across Eastern Europe, a development has emerged that neither Washington nor Moscow expected, a shift so sharp, so strategically explosive, that it has begun reshaping the entire architecture of the Ukraine war. Turkey and Poland, two nations historically shaped by conflict, pressure, and shifting alliances, have stepped into a new battlefield alignment, an alignment that has stunned Russia and even surprised the United States. What began as quiet coordination has evolved into a bold and unmistakable front, a second arc of support for Ukraine that could redefine the war's direction. The world had watched Poland operate as one of Ukraine's fiercest supporters from day one of the invasion. Weapons, armored vehicles, missile systems, humanitarian corridors, Poland became the logistical backbone of the Ukrainian resistance. But when Turkey stepped in, the equation shifted. Not just because Turkey is a NATO state, not just because Turkey is geographically pivotal, but because Turkey holds something no other NATO member does: an active line of communication with both Kyiv and Moscow, influence over the Black Sea, and a defense industry whose drones, missiles, and strategic autonomy have already rewritten battlefields from Libya to Nagorno-Karabakh. For Russia, this combination was the last thing it wanted to see. For the United States, it was an unexpected but powerful bonus. This shift didn't happen overnight. It began quietly: meetings between military advisors, joint assessments of the Ukrainian front, and exchanges between Turkish and Polish defense officials. But what changed everything was the realization that both countries shared the same fear: a long war that would not stay confined to Ukraine. Poland fears Russian advances more than any other NATO member. It has lived through centuries of occupation, partitions, wars, and foreign domination. For Poland, the sight of Russian troops advancing westward was nothing short of a nightmare. Turkey, meanwhile, saw something different: a chance to contain Russian power in the Black Sea, secure its influence in the region, and establish itself as a decisive power broker capable of outmaneuvering even the great powers. Together, they found alignment, and when alignment turns into action, it becomes a front. The first shock to Russia came not from tanks or missiles, but from intelligence sharing. Poland, long integrated with NATO systems, opened strategic channels to Turkey. Real-time battlefield assessments, drone footage, intercepted communications, and the movement patterns of Russian forces. Turkey, with its sophisticated drone warfare technology and surveillance networks, amplified Poland's intelligence with its own. Suddenly, Russia's troop placements, artillery concentrations, and supply lines became more visible than at any point since the war began. Ukraine didn't expect this level of coordination. Washington didn't either. The US knew Poland was committed. They knew Turkey was trying to balance its relations. But what they didn't see coming was how quickly Ankara would lean toward Warsaw's strategic logic. A logic rooted in the belief that the war cannot be frozen, cannot be paused, cannot be negotiated from weakness. A logic that demands action. This action began with drones. Turkey's Bayraktar TB2, already famous for destroying Russian armor in the early months of the war, returned in upgraded forms. Poland's defense industry began integrating Turkish tech with its own platforms, creating hybrid systems capable of operating in contested airspaces. These weren't symbolic moves. They were the foundations of a joint Turkish-Polish supply corridor specifically designed to sustain Ukrainian forces without bottlenecks, without bureaucratic delays, without political hesitation. Russia noticed quickly. Its radar stations in Crimea began picking up unfamiliar drone signatures, patterns that didn't match Ukrainian systems. Its electronic warfare units encountered drones with modified resistances, improved navigation, and new counter-jamming modules. These were unmistakably Turkish, but they were flying from Polish coordinated corridors. Moscow realized that a new front had materialized, a front of technology, logistics, and intelligence that stretched from Warsaw to Ankara and poured directly into Ukraine's operational theater. For Russia, this was more than frustrating, it was dangerous. Turkey had been one of Moscow's delicate diplomatic balances. The two nations cooperated on energy, regional politics, and trade. They disagreed sharply in Syria, Libya, and the Caucasus, but they maintained a working relationship. The Kremlin believed that relationship would prevent Turkey from going all in for Ukraine. That belief shattered the moment Turkish, Polish coordination became undeniable. Moscow suddenly faced the possibility that a NATO member controlling the Black Sea's most important choke points had decided to align more firmly against its operations. The United States, observing all of this, found itself surprised and relieved. Washington had long struggled to predict Turkey's moves. Ankara often acted independently, sometimes to the frustration of NATO, sometimes benefiting the alliance in unexpected ways. But the US quickly understood what Poland understood. Turkey's involvement meant added pressure on Russia from a direction it had not prepared for. A second wave of strategic complications, a narrative shift. A signal that Russia's assumptions about NATO divisions were fading. As the coordination deepened, joint training exercises began. Turkish drone pilots worked with Polish air defense units. Polish artillery crews studied battlefield data from Turkish analysts. Ukrainian officers quietly joined these sessions, absorbing lessons from both sides. Each exercise became more complex, more realistic, more aligned with Ukraine's actual front lines. Then came the shipments: heavy armor parts, missile guidance components, communication systems, drone engines, armored vehicle upgrades. These shipments bypassed routes Russia expected, moving through secure Turkish channels and Polish logistical hubs. For the first time, Ukraine enjoyed a steady, uninterrupted flow of support from two nations operating in perfect tactical harmony. Russia responded with warnings, statements, threats. Russian state media began accusing Turkey of betrayal. Analysts close to the Kremlin claimed Turkey had abandoned neutrality. But the reality was simpler. Turkey saw an opportunity to check Russian power while strengthening its ties with Europe's most Russia-resistant nation. Poland saw a partner capable of delivering the technologies and strategic pressure it could not generate alone. Their interests aligned precisely where Moscow least wanted them to. On the ground, Ukrainian troops began to feel the difference. New drone fleets watched over Russian armor day and night. Artillery targeting became more accurate. Russian supply lines that once relied on night movements found themselves visible even in the dark. The war's dynamic shifted from a grinding stalemate to a more unpredictable, more aggressive Ukrainian posture. Every strike, every interdiction, every destroyed convoy bore the fingerprints of this new alliance. The political ripple effects grew louder. European capitals took note. NATO planners began integrating Turkish, Polish coordination into broader strategic discussions. Kyiv openly praised the cooperation. Meanwhile, Russia increased its air defenses around Crimea and eastern Ukraine, anticipating new waves of drone and missile attacks. It began moving assets farther from the front, worried that its traditional safe zones were no longer safe. Intelligence indicated that Russia started viewing Turkey's defense industry as a potential long-term threat to its military operations, but the story doesn't end with drones and intelligence. The biggest shock came when Turkey and Poland began discussing integrated maritime security operations in the Black Sea. While Turkey controls the straits, Poland controls some of Europe's most important land corridors. Together, they could create a multi-domain presence capable of restricting Russian logistics and reinforcing Ukraine's coastline defenses. This idea alone sent alarm bells through Moscow. If implemented, it could limit Russia's maneuverability in the Black Sea, complicate its naval supply routes, and strengthen Ukraine's control over its southern front. The US watched all of this with growing surprise, not because it disagreed, but because it didn't expect two states with such different geopolitical histories to align so quickly and so decisively. American analysts began openly acknowledging that Turkey's pivot toward Poland's strategic vision could be one of the most consequential shifts since the war began. What started as coordination has become a partnership. What began as military support has become a second front, and what once seemed like a fragmented international response is evolving into a new structure, one that Russia never anticipated. The war is far from over. Russia is adapting, recalibrating, searching for ways to counter the growing pressure, but one thing has become clear: Turkey and Poland have changed the board, rearranged the pieces, and forced Moscow to confront a reality it hoped to avoid. As the winter deepens and the next phases of the war approach, Ukraine knows it is no longer fighting with Western aid alone. It now has a powerful dual engine behind it, one positioned in the heart of Eastern Europe, the other at the gateway between continents. A partnership that has surprised the United States, stunned Russia, and created a new front that could determine the future of the war.